Chapter 3. Friendships and Jealousies. "Come on, Tom, I'll show you some of my paintings." Dickie led the way into the big room Tom had looked into a couple of times on his way to and from the shower. "This is one of Marge I'm working on now." "Oh," Tom said with interest. It wasn't good in his opinion, probably in anybody's opinion. "And these, a lot of paintings of the seashore." Dickie obviously wanted Tom to say something nice about them, because he was proud of them. They were all wild and all the same. "How long are you going to be here?" Dickie asked. "Oh, at least a week, I think," Tom answered. "Because—" Dickie's face was red from the wine, which had put him in a good mood. "If you're going to be here a little longer, why don't you stay with me? There's no reason to stay in a hotel, unless you prefer it." "Thank you very much," Tom said. "There's a bed in the other room, which you didn't see." The next morning, Tom moved in. "Are we still going to Naples?" Tom asked. "Remember? We talked about it yesterday." "Certainly." Dickie looked at his watch. "It's only 11:45. We can make the 12 o'clock bus." The bus was just arriving as they reached the post office. Dickie stopped running, right in the face of a young man with red hair and a bright sports shirt, an American. "Dickie! Freddie!" Dickie yelled. "What are you doing here?" "Came to see you. And the Checkies. They're giving me a place to stay for a few days." "I'm off to Naples with a friend. Tom?" Dickie introduced them. The American's name was Freddie Miles. Tom thought he was disgusting. He hated red hair. Freddie had large red-brown eyes that shook in his head. He was also very heavy. "See you tonight, Freddie." About an hour later, the bus left Tom and Dickie in Naples. "I know a good place for lunch," Dickie said. "A real Neapolitan pizza place. Do you like pizza?" They sat there until 5 o'clock. Dickie had spent most of the time talking about Freddie, and Tom had found the conversation as uninteresting as Freddie's face. Then they moved to a cafe called the Galleria. "This is what I like," Dickie said, "sitting at a table and watching the people go by. It really improves your attitude toward life." A well-dressed Italian greeted Dickie warmly and sat down at the table with them. Tom listened to their conversation in Italian, understanding a word here and there. "Want to go to Rome?" Dickie asked him suddenly. "Sure," Tom said. "Now?" The Italian had a long, gray car with a loud radio that he and Dickie seemed happy to shout over. They reached Rome in about 2 hours, and the Italian dropped them in the middle of a street and said a quick goodbye. In Rome, they bought tickets for a music show that evening. After the show, they had dinner and drank a bottle and a half of wine. They were in a fine mood by 1 in the morning. They walked with their arms around each other's shoulders, singing and talking. Neither had the slightest idea what street they were on. "When the sun comes up, we can see where we are," Dickie said cheerfully. He looked at his watch. "Only a couple more hours." The next morning they returned to Naples, just in time to catch the bus for Montebello. When they reached Montebello, Marge was annoyed because Dickie hadn't called to say he was spending the night in Rome. "I don't mind, of course, but I thought you were in Naples, and anything can happen in Naples." Tom kept his mouth shut. He wasn't going to tell Marge anything they had done. Let her imagine what she pleased. Dickie had made it clear that they had had a very good time. Marge had the look of a mother or an older sister now. The woman's dislike of the rough play of little boys and men. Or was it jealousy? She seemed to know that Dickie had formed a closer friendship with Tom in 24 hours just because he was another man than she could ever have with Dickie, whether he loved her or not. And he didn't. For the next 3 or 4 days, they didn't see much of Marge. Tom, anyway, kept Dickie amused. He had lots of funny stories to tell about New York. Some of them true, some of them invented. Obviously, Dickie was enjoying his company. Tom wrote to Mr. Greenleaf, promising him that Dickie was considering returning to the United States. He had to smile as he wrote the letter, because he and Dickie were talking of visiting the Greek islands this winter. Marge wouldn't be going, Tom was sure. Both he and Dickie left her out of their travel plans when they discussed them. Dickie was paying attention to Marge because he knew she'd be lonely in Montebello by herself. But one day, when they asked her to go to the Roman ruins at Herculaneum, she refused. "I think I'll stay home. You boys enjoy yourselves," she said, with an effort at a cheerful smile. "Well, if she won't, she won't," Tom said, and then walked calmly into the house so that she and Dickie could talk alone on the terrace if they wanted to. After a few minutes, the gate slammed. Marge had left. Tom walked out of the house and onto the terrace. "Was she angry about something?" Tom asked. "No, she feels kind of ignored, I suppose." "I feel like I'm getting in the way of your relationship with Marge." "Of course not. Getting in the way of what?" "Well, she might think so." "No. It's just that I owe her something, and I haven't been particularly nice to her lately. We haven't. It's after 2. Want to take a little walk and go by the post office?" They walked down the hill in silence. What had Marge said about him, Tom wondered. Dickie came out of his silence only to greet Luigi, the post office worker, and thank him for his letter. Tom had no mail. "I think I'll go up to see Marge," Dickie said. "I won't be long, but don't wait." "All right," Tom said, feeling suddenly desperate. About halfway up the hill, he had the sudden need to go to Marge's house. He could go with the excuse of apologizing to her, but satisfy his anger by surprising and annoying them. He suddenly felt that Dickie was touching her at this minute, and partly he wanted to see it, and partly he hated the idea of seeing it. Tom stopped near Marge's apartment. One of her bras was hanging out of the window. Through the window he could see that Dickie's arm was around her waist. Dickie was kissing her. Little kisses on her cheek. Smiling at her. Tom was disgusted. He knew Dickie didn't mean it. He knew Dickie was using this cheap, easy way to hold on to her friendship. Tom turned away and ran down the steps, wanting to scream. He ran all the way to Dickie's house and sat on the couch in Dickie's living room for a few moments, his mind shocked and empty. He went into Dickie's bedroom and walked around for a few moments, his hands in his pockets. He wondered when Dickie was coming back. Or was he going to stay all afternoon? Really take her to bed with him? He opened Dickie's closet door and looked in. There was a new-looking gray suit. Tom took it out. He took off his shorts and put on the gray pants. He put on a pair of Dickie's shoes. Then he opened the bottom drawer and took out a clean blue and white shirt. "Marge, you must understand that I don't love you," Tom said into the mirror in Dickie's voice. "Marge, stop it." Tom turned suddenly and made a move in the air, pretending to grab Marge's throat. He shook her, twisted her down to the floor. He was breathing heavily. "You know why I had to do that," he said, addressing Marge, though he watched himself in the mirror. "You were coming between Tom and me." "No, not that. but there is something between us." He turned, stepped over the imaginary body, and went to the window. He could see the bottom of the steps that led up to Marge's house. Maybe they were sleeping together, Tom thought with disgust. He ran back to the closet and took a hat from the top shelf. He put it on. It surprised him how much he looked like Dickie, with the top part of his head covered. Really, it was only his darker hair that was very different from Dickie. But his nose, his narrow jaw, his eyes... "What are you doing?" Tom turned around quickly. Dickie was in the doorway. "Oh, just amusing myself. Sorry, Dickie." Dickie slammed the door loudly. "Please get out of my clothes." "Are you and Marge okay?" Tom tried to calm himself as he hung up the suit. "Marge and I are fine," Dickie yelled. "Another thing I want to say," he said, looking at Tom. "I'm not in love with you. I don't know if you have the idea that I am or not." "In love with me?" Tom smiled weakly. "I never thought you were." "Well, Marge thinks you're in love with me." "Why?" Tom felt the blood go out of his face. "What have I ever done?" "It's just the way you act," Dickie said, and went out of the door. Tom put his shorts back on and followed Dickie. Just because Dickie liked him, Tom thought, Marge had spread her dirty ideas about him to Dickie. "Are you in love with Marge?" "No, but I feel sorry for her. I care about her. She's been very nice to me. We've had some good times together. You don't seem to be able to understand that. I'm going to keep her friendship." "Well, have I done anything to prevent you?" "I told you, Dickie, I'd rather leave than do anything to hurt your friendship with Marge." Dickie looked at Tom. "No, you haven't done anything specifically, but it's obvious you don't like her around." "I'm sorry," Tom said sincerely. He was sorry he hadn't made more of an effort, that he had done a bad job. "Well, let's forget it. Marge and I are okay." Dickie turned away and stared out at the water. Tom went into the kitchen to make himself some coffee. This wasn't the time to be too friendly with Dickie. Dickie had his pride. He would be silent for most of the afternoon, then come back in by about 5 o'clock, after he had been painting for a time, and everything would be the same as before. One thing Tom was sure of. Dickie was glad to have him here. Dickie was bored with living by himself, and bored with Marge, too. Tom still had $300 left, and he and Dickie were going to use it on a trip to Paris.